Morning, folks. Welcome to another daily devotional. This morning, we're going to start into chapter 3 of Philippians. We've been using Philippians as the basis of our daily devotions for the past while. And as we start into chapter 3 this morning, you'll notice that the initial subject that Paul deals with is a subject that has really plagued the church down through its history. And that is the presence of false teachers within the church. Those whose teachings and whose practices, whenever they're analysed in the light of God's word, they're found to be contrary to the true message of the gospel and indeed to the true requirements of biblical Christian living. Paul, of course, had encountered false teachers all over the place. Everywhere he went and preached the gospel and established churches, invariably people went off on a tangent and began to introduce teachings that were contrary to the true gospel. And he found the same was happening in Philippi. And as we come to this third chapter, we discover that this church, although it was one of the best churches that Paul had ever established, because he does speak of it as his joy and his crown, Paul discovered that there were those in the fellowship in Philippi who were moving towards and teaching false doctrine. So what we want to think about this morning is that the warning that Paul issues here against false teachers. He says in verse 2, watch out for those dogs, those men who do evil, those mutilators of the flesh. Now, before we look at what these false teachers were actually teaching, I think it's important for us to notice just how serious Paul viewed this problem. And there are a couple of things that underscore this. First of all, we should notice that this wasn't the first time that Paul had dealt with this subject in relation to the Philippians, because in verse 1 he says, it's no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard to you. And then he goes on to warn them against false teachers. So it seems as though Paul has already dealt with this subject in relation to the Philippians in the past. Might have been while he had visited them, might have actually been at the very beginning when the church was established, might have been in another letter that he'd written to them that we don't know. But one thing's for sure, he didn't mind going over the same ground again, repeating again the things that he had previously told them. In fact, he saw repetition as being a safeguard, telling them again things that he had told them before. And that's not a bad principle, to go over again things that we already know, so that they become more and more embedded in our minds and become part of how we think and of who we are. And in the verses before us, that's what Paul's doing. He's going over stuff that he had told them before. So Paul obviously viewed false teaching as being something serious and something that he needed to deal with. The other thing that shows us how serious Paul viewed the threat of false teaching in the church is the way in which he frames the warning to his hearers. The actual language that he uses, the NIV, from which I quoted earlier, is rather weak. It says, watch out for those dogs, those men who do evil, those mutilators of the flesh. If you look at the King James Version, you'll notice that the word beware is used, and it's actually repeated 3 times. Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision. And that's in fact the way it is in the original Greek language. There's a strong emphasis here on the serious nature of the threat posed, so threatening, so serious, that Paul says, beware, beware, beware. One commentator says the following: the threefold use of beware indicates urgency. Another commentator, some of you will know the name William Hendrickson, he says the 3 words are, as it were, blows of the gavel, signalling for attention, in order that the church at Philippi, by giving heed, may be safeguarded against the spiritual loss. So these things show us that Paul is taking these matters seriously. And then Paul uses very strong terms to describe these false teachers. We'll look at this in our study tomorrow. He calls them dogs, he calls them evil workers, he calls them mutilators of the flesh. He doesn't hold back when speaking of these false teachers, he uses the most scathing of terms. So Paul obviously saw false teaching in the church as something that was really serious, and it posed a real threat to the spiritual health and well-being of the congregation. And I think that we need to realize that false teaching, whether it's teaching in relation to doctrines or teaching in relation to behavior, in other words, morals, this is something serious. And if it isn't stopped, if it isn't confronted and dealt with, it can prove to be very detrimental to the well-being of a congregation, of a denomination, of a church. So, brethren, pay attention to these things regarding false teaching, and don't be dragged away by all kinds of false doctrine. Tomorrow we look at exactly what these men were teaching and why it was so pernicious. So have a good day and trust that you've been blessed.